The World Fly Fishing Championships in 2019 will be conducted under FIPS Mouche competition rules. These rules are in place to ensure the integrity and consistency in the organising of the competition.
So the controller is responsible for making sure that they filled out their competitor's score sheet accurately. This includes putting down the species that was caught, measuring the length to the nearest millimetre, and then the time in which the fish was caught. When marking down the length of the fish that was caught, make sure it's to the nearest millimetre, but also record in this section. So for the first fish here, we've got 324 millimetres, we've marked 300, 20 and 4 in that section at the top there. So after every fish is caught, you must make sure that your competitor initials here after they've been measured and the fish has been released. Then at the end of the session, you want to make sure that you put lines through all of the blank spaces on the end of the score sheet. So if you're concerned that any of the fish that have caught shouldn't count, make sure you write that down in the remarks section here. This will then get looked at after the session. So still measure the fish, write down what your concern is, and then that'll get handled after the session.
The controller must measure each fish presented to him and does not have the authority to release the fish until measurement is completed. Controllers are responsible for warning competitors of a violation of the rules. A verbal warning is the first course of action. In case of a dispute, such as the use of a barbed fly, the controller must keep evidence for presentation. This will then be recorded on the competitor's scorecard. If a competitor hooks a fish in the session and then the session ends, they will have 10 minutes from the end of the session to land that fish. Only fish hooked in the mouth area, that is in front of the gill cover, will be scored.
This is a good example of a foul hooked fish. Here is the end of the gill plate, just here, and a straight line up above that and a straight line down, and this is clearly hooked behind the gill plate. So if you draw a straight line up here and a straight line down there, if this fish was hooked under here, it would count. All of this counts, all of this counts. Once you reach this point here, anything backward of that, it does not count. So this fish has been foul hooked and this fish would not count at all. Now be mindful that sometimes the fly bounces out and of the fish in the net, and sometimes it can end up sticking somewhere else in the fish, but that is the call of the controller. So if you can clearly see that fish is foul hooked, or you believe it to be foul hooked, you cannot count that fish, and it goes back as if the fish was never caught. It's a very important rule. They're all as important as one another, but it's important to remember, and you stick by your guns as a controller because you're in charge in the end of the day, and they've got to do what you say. And this fish is foul hooked, it goes back, it's not measured.
If a competitor wishes a fish to score, he must present it to the controller in the net. He must not handle the fish in any way.
Okay, so here I am with Casey now, my controller, and I've got the fish in the net. Casey's come down to the water's edge. She's not in the water because she's not allowed in the water, but she's not a long way back from the bank because otherwise I've got to carry this fish up over dry land, and if something happens to the fish is harmed or the fish dies, it doesn't count. So it's in my best interest that this fish goes back in a healthy way and it's measured quickly because it's good for the fish and it also gives me more time back on the water. So Casey's come down to the edge of the water, perfect. Sometimes the banks are not easy to negotiate through trees and that, and you have to work out with the competitor beforehand where the likely measuring spots are, and they'll try and communicate with you as best as possible to make sure that you're in the right place at the right time. So once I hand this fish over to Casey, she's going to make sure that one, the fish is not foul hooked. So it means it's got to be hooked forward of the gill plates. So as long as it's forward of the gill plates, top of the head, underneath the chin, that's all fine. Anything behind the gill plates, it's not going to count. A lot of the time, the fly will fall out in the net because they're barbless, so they will fall out in the net often. And unless you've actually seen that it's been foul hooked during playing of the fish, then the likelihood is you'll just assume that it's been hooked fairly. Once I hand this over to Casey like this, my responsibilities are now done, so I cannot touch the fish. If I put my hand in like this to help get the fly out or go to touch the fish, that is illegal and that fish will not count. So the controller is the only person who's now allowed to touch the fish, unless in releasing the fish they ask you to release it for them because they can't get to the water's edge. So through all this process of them, I'm just going to put it back in the water for the health of the fish, but through all this process, I'm not allowed to touch the fish, I'm not allowed to go put my hands inside the net. if the controller drops the fish. So once I've handed this to the controller and the controller touches the net, then it's the controller's responsibility. If the controller drops the fish into the water and the fish swims away before it has been measured, then that will be marked on the scorecard that you caught a fish, that the competitor caught a fish, and the competitor will get the length of fish that's the average for the session. So with every competitor fishing on that river in that session, whatever the average length of fish is, when all those fish are averaged out, they will get the average length for fish. So it's not the end of the world if the fish gets dropped in the water. Obviously from a competitor's point of view, it's great when they drop a small one, and it's not very good when they drop a big one. But it's best overall if you handle the fish well, far enough back from the bank that they can't fall back in, but not too close, or far that it's going to either damage the fish because you're too far, or it's you get yourself wet. So here we go. I hand the fish over to Casey. She's going to grab it out, check for the hook. The hook has actually dropped out because I've had it on for a while, and I'm just going to sit and watch how long the fish is. So Casey measures the fish well. She checks which tail is the longest, the longer of the two, and as you can see from there, it is 28 centimeters exactly. So this is the sort of fish that can cause a few issues between competitors and controllers. Because due to the scoring system that we mentioned earlier, whereby a 28 centimeter fish is measured at 28 centimeters, if you want to pop him back in there and we'll just keep him in the water, that fish will score as a 28 centimeter fish and get points for 28. If that fish had been 28.1 centimeters, so 1 millimeter over, it would have been scored as a 29 centimeter fish. So competitors, when it's that tight, will try and get the fish to measure 1 millimeter over. It's the most important measurement. 28.1 mils will be scored at 29 centimeters. 28.2, 3, 4, 5, it's all scored at 29, all the way up to 29. And then 29.1 gets scored at 30 centimeters, and it's all extra points. So this is actually quite a good example of ensuring that you get to the millimeter absolutely right, because the competitor will often try and get you to agree that it's 1 millimeter over, because in that case it may as well be 10 millimeters longer, because it's going to score that amount of points. So it's very important that the measurement is correct. If there are any arguments at all with fish length, then the fish can actually be killed and taken to a tribunal, but that is very, very unlikely and very rare and very unlikely to happen, because obviously no one wants that to occur. So it's important that you agree on the measurement of the fish. You'll then write the measurement down on the scorecard. The competitor then initials it, that he agrees that that was the length of the fish, and there's no comeback later on that they say, oh no, that fish was bigger. So they sign to agree, yes, that is the length of the fish, I agree, and they get back fishing. Now, it's extremely important that this process occurs as fast as possible. Competitors practice and train to tie their knots a few seconds more quickly so that they can get more time on the water. And it's very frustrating from a competitor's point of view if the controller is mucking around and dropping the fish and handling it poorly and doing all of those sorts of things, and it takes ages and a long time to write things down. They've lost the measuring board, they can't find the paper. So it's very important to be organised so that the competitor can get in, get the fish measured, the fish can go back.
The controller is responsible for removing the hook, reviving the fish and releasing it without harm. If the hook can't be removed, the leader should be cut as close as possible to the fish, and then the fish will be released without harm. If the controller is not able to release the fish, he is able to give the competitor permission to release the fish safely.
So Christopher has brought his fish to me on the bank. Just checking for the fly inside the mouth, which it is, so I can remove this fly now. If I can't remove this fly, I am able to cut the line so that I can return the fish safely to the water. This one's popped out fine. Okay, so in the measuring board, making sure his nose is at the front, and we find the longest tip of the tail, so it's this bottom side. When you're looking at the numbers here, this fish is measuring 38.7, not 39.7. 39 is when we reach this point here. So 38.7, happy with that, Christopher?
Very happy, thank you.
And we can put him back in the water. as you're unhooking the fish, you should always make sure that the fly is barbless. If it's in doubt, you can just pop it in a shirt or something. If it catches, it's obviously got a barb. These can't be crushed or filed, they need to be chemically sharpened, barbless hooks.
If the controller or another official determines that a fish has been injured by a competitor, that fish will not score.
There are a few rules that govern what competitors can do and their gear and the setup relating to flies, fly lines, knots, etc. And these are all things that are the responsibility of the controller to ensure that the competitors are doing these correctly and as per the FIPS Mouche rules. This is best done before the start of the session because it doesn't cut into fishing time, and it's easy because all the gear is out, the person is setting up their gear and you can check it there and then. Now that doesn't mean you can't check it later, you can check it whenever you like, but often there's no need to check things like distance between flies when they're out on the water because you've already checked it. If you see someone change their fly 3 or 4 times, you know that that distance is getting shorter. Then when they catch a fish and bring it into you, by all means check it on the measuring board to make sure that those flies are at least 50 centimetres apart when they're hanging between the knots, so at least 50 centimetres apart. If they're closer than that fish does not count. So you have to do that when you're on the water. However, the best time to get all that sorted out is before you get out there. Then the competitor knows that you're onto it, you're aware of the rules, you're making sure that he's abiding by them and fishing within them. And if there's anything wrong here, then he can change it. It doesn't cut into his fishing time. And everyone's happy because you know that he's abiding by the rules. He knows that you're keeping an eye on it and it's fair for everyone. So let's have a look at some of those things now. Let's have a look at this measuring gauge that will be provided to all the controllers at the World Fly Fishing Championships. So this is the official gauge. Let's have a closer look at it. If the hook length that the competitor is using fits within the 20mm horizontal slot, so this here is 2 centimetres, right? That's 20 mils. If it fits within that, so the hook is that big or smaller, then the maximum body thickness must fit through the 5mm vertical slot, which is this one. So if the hook is smaller than that, then the fly still has to be able to fit through that. Now you can push it through, squeeze it through, it doesn't have to fit through easily, it just has to go through that slot. Now the 4mm round circular hole is the maximum diameter allowed, here we go, for a bead. So all beads on the hooks have to fit through that hole. That's a 4mm hole. Don't worry about this hole, that's just for attaching it to your shirt or to the board or something else. This is the 4mm hole and all beads have to be able to fit through that. So if it's too big, then you can't use that fly. Very important. If the hook length is longer than the 20mm horizontal slot, so this slot here, if the hook length is longer, then the body thickness must fit between the 3mm vertical slot. So this is a 3mm vertical slot. It's a little bit manky. This is an old one and it's closed up a bit. Apologies for that. But this is a 3mm slot here. So if the hook length is longer than that, then the whole fly has to be able to be pushed through that slot there. Unlikely to be an issue for river controllers in Tasmania for the World Championships, but you need to know the rules. If it's longer than that, it has to fit through that. The maximum hook length cannot be longer than the entire measuring gauge. So this is 40mm, right? 4 centimetres, that's the total length of this. And you cannot use a hook longer than that length. It's pretty simple, it's as simple as that. And finally, not on this one here, but the minimum diameter of a line of any fly line that's being used is 0.55mm. So there'll be another slot cut in there and the fly line must not fit through that slot. If it fits through that slot, it means that the fly line is less than 0.55 and it has to be 0.55 or greater. And that's a summary of that little gauge you'll get. When you're checking the competitor's gear, one of the things you're going to have to look at are their rods. So for starters, they're not allowed to use a rod that's longer than 12 feet long. So basically 2 arm spans. And I'd be surprised if someone did, but you've got to be aware of the rule. And if they do, it's generally for Euro style nymphing. So no rod is allowed to be longer than 12 foot long. Secondly, in Tasmania in the World Championships, they can have as many rods made up as they want. So if they want to carry 30 rods, they can carry 30 rods. If they want one, they just can rig up one. So it's up to them, but there is no limit to the number of rods they're allowed to set up. And thirdly and finally, in regards to their rods, they are responsible for their own rods. So the controller is not to carry the rods for them. I know it's very helpful and it's great when you're a competitor when a controller will do that, but basically it's against the rules. It has to be the same for everyone. So a competitor will therefore generally put their rods on the bank at the various places where they think they might need them and then grab them when they get there, because it's quicker that way to do it. But it also means that they're leaving their gear unattended, and some don't like to do that. But that's the way the rules are. People can make up as many rods as they want, under 12 feet long, and it's their responsibility to either carry the rods on them or put them somewhere, and if something happens to them, it's not your fault. So let's have a look at fly lines and fly reels. There are actually no rules whatsoever that govern fly reels. So some reels are semi-automatic ones that people pull levers on and it reels the line in for them. Most people just use conventional reels, but really there are no rules governing reels, so you can forget about that. As far as the fly line is concerned, the only real rules that you need to concern yourself with is that you're not allowed shooting heads, but that's not going to affect people who are controlling in the rivers, and the diameter of the fly lines. The fly line has to be at least 0.55 millimetres or greater in diameter, so it's not allowed to be less than that. This is the fly line we're talking about, not the leader. The fly line has to be 0.55 or greater, and it has to have a coating on it. So the coating on it suggests that you can't use silk fly lines, that they have to be sort of the modern plastic PVC coated fly lines, and they have to be 0.55 mils or greater. And on the little measuring gauge that you've got, that we'll demonstrate to you later on, that fly line cannot fit through the slot that's in that gauge, because that slot is 0.53 millimetres, and if this line goes through it, it's clearly under 0.55. So that's very important. And the final thing is that loops on the end of your fly line. So loops are allowed on the very end of your fly line. This one here is a welded loop that often comes with manufactured lines nowadays. So competitors can have a loop on the end of their fly line. If they don't have one that's actually welded there and they've attached a piece of line to make a loop, that cannot be greater than 10 centimetres. So that loop cannot be more than 10 centimetres off the end of the fly line, right? So if someone has a thick piece of line here with a loop attached to it, if they're going to loop their leaders on and off, that cannot be greater than 10 centimetres. When it comes to leaders, this is very important that you're aware of the rules governing leaders. Most important one is that your total leader length is not allowed to be longer than 2 times as long as the rod. So if someone's using an 8-foot rod, then 16 feet is as long as their leader is allowed to be. If someone's using an 11-foot rod, it's 22 feet. And the best way to do that is to make sure the line is stripped off the reel, going through the guides, get the fly and put it at the butt of the rod, and get the end of the fly line and put it on the butt of the rod. And if there's any slack line there, then obviously the leader is too long. So the leader cannot be longer than twice the length of the rod. And it's a very important rule to make sure that people are upholding, especially when they're doing Euro nymphing, because people will want to use longer leaders than that if they can. But the rules stipulate 2 times as long as the rod is the longest leader that you can use from fly line to the knot on the fly. Now, other thing with leaders is you can use bought tapered leaders, or you can make up your own leaders. The leader has to taper from thick to thin, so it can't go from thick to thin and then back to thick again in diameter. So it can either be level or it has to be tapering down. It can't taper back up again, so it's important to keep an eye on that. If people are tying up their leaders, and certainly they'll be tying tippets on and perhaps sections on leaders, the closest the 2 knots can be is 30 centimetres. So the knots cannot be closer together than 30 centimetres. And that is when it's hanging. Sometimes people will use coils as indicators, and when you pull the coil tight, it measures 50 centimetres, but when you let go and the coil springs back up again, it's less than 30. So that is illegal. It has to be more than 30 centimetres hanging up and down like that. So no knots closer together than 30 centimetres, tapered leaders going from thick to thin, and twice the length of the rod is the maximum length that you're allowed to use. Competitors will use droppers that come off their main line, come off their tippet or come off their leader. And that's how flies need to be attached. They need to be attached to droppers. The flies can't be attached to the actual main line itself. So a dropper will be attached and the fly will be on the end of that. Now obviously the distance between the fly and the knot on the dropper is going to be less than 30 centimetres, and that's not what the rule is talking about in regard to being 30 centimetres apart. It's 30 centimetres within the leader or longer. You'll find that flies will be very, very close to the main line, but they have to be on a dropper. They can't actually be attached to the main line itself with the leader then continuing on to other flies. Very important. Micro rings can be used, so small metallic rings can be used, up to 3 maximum in the whole setup. So you can only have 3 micro rings in the entire setup and only 3 knots per ring. So if the main line comes down to the ring and continues and you have a dropper coming off it, that's fine, but you can't then have another dropper coming off the other side. So 3 knots per micro ring, 3 rings maximum. You cannot put lead or any weighted devices like that on the leader to get the leader deeper. The weight is within the fly, so none of that. And you can't attach strike indicators or float indicators either. If you're going to use an indicator, then the competitor has to have a hook in it, so it'll be an actual fly that they may well be using as an indicator, but it is a fly tied on a hook and obviously counts as one of the 3 flies that you're allowed to use, the maximum number of flies that you can use when you're fishing in this competition. So nothing can be added like lead or indicators. Some people will use a grease on their line, no doubt, which is easy to see and makes it float, and some of that grease might be coloured. That's legal, but as long as they're not actually attaching lead to the line or attaching a big strike indicator or sight indicator with no hook in it to the line, then it's legal. Now let's have a quick look at the flies that competitors may be using and some of the things around flies that are legal and illegal. The main one is that in your setup, in the leader setup, the flies cannot be closer than 50 centimetres. And again, that's hanging. So if I'm holding the leader and my first fly is hanging here and my second fly is down here, the distance between the knots of those 2 flies has to be 50 centimetres or greater. And the best time to check that is when people are setting up, but keep an eye on them on the water, because obviously if you've measured and you know that those flies are quite close together and someone's changing flies, then that distance may well shorten up and you need to check it again later on when they bring a fish into you and make sure that the flies are at least 50 centimetres apart. You can use the measuring board that you'll be issued with. You can lay the flies on the measuring board, hang them straight down. You've got one fly at the 50 centimetre mark. The other one should be beyond that, of course, should be lying on the bottom of the board. So the flies cannot be closer together than 50 centimetres when they're hanging vertically. So that's very, very important. Flies can't be heavier than 2 grams, but that's unlikely to cause any issues in Tasmania, I wouldn't imagine. And when the flies are made with beads, you cannot have 2 exposed beads. So if there's an exposed bead at the front of the fly, the other bead has to be covered with something, and paint is not regarded as being covered with something, so it actually has to be perhaps under some dubbing or under something else. You cannot have 2 exposed beads, you can only have 1 exposed bead. The maximum size of that bead is 4 millimetres. Any bead that's greater than 4 millimetres is illegal. And you'll be given a little gauge, which you're going to see later on, and hopefully demonstrate to you the hole in the gauge whereby you pass the fly through to ensure that the fly is less than 4 millimetres. To the eye, you should be able to see it. It's a good idea to have a look at what a 4 millimetre bead looks like because it's vastly different to the smaller ones. It really does look quite big. So if you can familiarise yourself with that, so you're not checking every single bead, just look at the heavier ones, the bigger ones, make sure they fit through the slot, and that's absolutely fine. But the most important one is 50 centimetres apart. That is the closest that 2 flies can be, and it's important that controllers stay onto that as much as possible. All flies also have to be barbless. So these flies have to be made on barbless hooks, and they have to be manufactured barbless hooks. They can't be hooks that have had the barb filed off them. So you need to have a look at the hooks that people are using when they're rigging up. Most people will already be tying all their flies on purely barbless hooks anyway, but it is your responsibility to ensure that all hooks are barbless. So you can check them when they're rigging up because it's nice and easy. If someone brings a fish into you and you're having trouble getting the hook out, then it's certainly worth checking that. putting it in your clothing to ensure you'll get a little piece of cloth that you can put it in and out, and it should pass in and out of there 3 times. It doesn't take long to do that, so do it nice and quickly so it doesn't waste the competitor's time. But it is a part of the rules. You have to ensure that all competitors are using barbless hooks and that all of those hooks are manufactured barbless, and you'll be able to see that simply by looking at them. And don't be afraid to ask to see a hook, because it is part of the rules and something that's taken very seriously. One of the most important things from a controller's point of view, as well as a competitor's point of view, is knowing where the beats are. So you need to know where the beat is that you're controlling on. So this is an example here. This sign here says beat 17. This is the top of beat 17 down here. And in all international competitions, there's a buffer zone between the beats where no one is allowed. So no one's allowed to fish there, no one's allowed to step there at any stage inside the water. So here we have the top of beat 17 and then the buffer zone. And if you look across the river to the other side, you'll see 2 markers on the other bank. The bottom one is clearly the top of beat 17 and then the buffer zone, and that is the bottom of beat 16. So quite clearly no one is allowed to fish or walk inside that area. And from a controller's point of view, you know, if I was the controller on beat 17, then I know that my controller can only fish up to this point, and his flies can only land in the water below a straight line path between those 2 markers there. So if the fly lands upstream of that marker and he catches a fish, it doesn't count. And if you saw the flies landing there or fishing in that area, you would let them know that that cast is an illegal cast and not to cast there again. Even more importantly, when you arrive at your beat as a competitor, you want to know where the top of your beat is and where the bottom of your beat is immediately. So you're allowed a minimum of half an hour to get ready. So often controllers have to get to the top and the bottom of their beats very quickly with the competitors to show them where it is. And once they've seen the top marker and the bottom marker of their beat and understand that that is their beat, their minimum half an hour time starts then. Of course, they'd rather have an hour, hour and a half, and that's how people will try and have the competition, so that the competitors have plenty of time to see their beats. But you need to know quickly where it is. The competitor wants to know where it is, so you need to show them, which means you need to know exactly where your beat is. So if you can get there earlier, days before, or get to learn exactly where your beat markers are, then I suggest you do that, because it's much easier for you and much easier for the competitor as well. The way the beats are numbered in any international competition is that the highest beat upstream is beat number 1, and the lowest beat downstream is beat number, let's say 25, if there were 25 competitors or 25 countries. So the lowest beat in the river is the highest number, and the highest beat is the lowest number. Occasionally there can be a complication with beat markers, particularly on the opposite bank. Sometimes beats are allocated across the middle of a pool, and it's simply impossible to get a beat marker on the other bank or get a ribbon tied in a tree or anything like that. So therefore there'll be a beat marker on the bank you arrive on, but not one on the other side of the river. And in that instance, what you'll do is you'll draw a line perpendicular to the current, so 90 degrees to the current, straight across to the other side, and you will agree with your competitor where the bottom of the beat is going to be, or the top of the beat if it's a top beat marker. So there might be a big tree on the other bank, or a stump in the water, or a rock, or something like that, where you'll draw a straight line from the beat marker on your bank, straight across, and the beat is either above or below that, and the buffer zone is either above or below that. And that's how you get away with beating an area that's very deep where you can't get to the opposite side. So I'm going to demonstrate to you what I was discussing earlier on in regard to where you can and can't fish in regard to buffer zones. So the bottom of my beat is this mark here, and if I'm swinging streamers like I am now, what often happens is if I make a cast, so I'm casting inside my beat, and the flies land inside my beat, but they swing downstream, they're actually going to go beyond the bottom of my beat, and my flies are now in the buffer zone. Now that is illegal, you cannot do it, and it happens very regularly, and it's something that controllers need to look out for, particularly in the latter sessions. None of this water has been fished, and sometimes it's just human nature that people want to get their flies down and push the boundary. So it's very important that a controller is standing on the beat markers, looking carefully to see where the fly is in relation to the beat markers. And the problem that people have is that the controller will see the fly landing within the beat. That's perfectly legal, but now the current is taking the flies down out of the beat. And as soon as those flies go near the buffer zone, the controller should say, that's not in your beat, pick your flies up and recast. and give them a warning, because you're not allowed to fish in the buffer zone. And of course, if a fish is hooked in the buffer zone, of course it doesn't count. So all fish have to be hooked inside the beat. The flies at no point can go down into the buffer zone, and neither can the angler. So the angler cannot stand below these marks and cast up into his beat. He's not even allowed to get into the water in the buffer zone. The buffer zone here is a no-go area. You're not allowed in here at any stage. So I can't sneak in here and fish up. So my flies might be landing in my beat, but I'm standing out of it. That is illegal. At no time can anything go down below the beat or above the beat in the buffer zones. Everything has to occur within the beat area. The only exception to that rule is if a fish is hooked and the fish runs down into the buffer zone, and it could in theory run down into the beat below as well. The angler can come up to the edge of the buffer zone, the bottom of their beat. They're not allowed in it at any stage, and fight the fish from here. The fish is down there in the buffer zone. It can't be helped, but he's not allowed to go into the buffer zone to net the fish. But if the fish runs down there, he's got to fight it back up. So that's legal. If the fish is hooked in the beat, runs into the buffer zone, it's unavoidable. The angler can stand inside his beat, fight the fish down in the buffer zone, or even sometimes if it goes down into the beat below him, it's not his fault. Play the fish back up into his beat, net it in his beat, and then come to the controller staying within his beat. He's not allowed in the buffer zone at any stage. So communication between the controller and the angler is very important, and it's not always easy because not everyone speaks very good English. However, when you're talking to your competitor or competitor's talking to you, they will likely try and ask you to stand in certain areas when they're fishing, and it's not going to be in front of them. So as a general rule, if you're having trouble communicating with your competitor for language barrier reasons, always stay behind the competitor. So the competitor will generally fishes in an upstream fashion, and you do not want to be upstream of where the angler is standing. You're better off being behind them and back off the bank, so you're not going to spook the fish. Just like at the start of the day when you're showing the competitor their beat, you don't want to be walking anywhere near the water. You want to be a long way off the water, as far back as you can be from the water. And sometimes it's best to walk behind your competitor. So you say, look, the beat's up here, and follow them up the bank and sort of direct them, but they will set the distance from the river that they want you to walk because they don't want to spook fish. So similarly, when the competitor is fishing, you never want to be ahead of them, never, unless they tell you that they want you there for some reason. Maybe they're swinging downstream again and they want you up there. You want to stay back from the bank. You've got to be able to see the competitor at all times. So you can't go somewhere where you can't see them because you have to watch them and make sure that all the rules are being abided by. So you need to be able to see them, back from the bank and behind them, so that when they hook them, they're likely to fight the fish downstream and land it downstream, and you're in a good position to see that. So it's very important from a competitor controller point of view that you stay out of the way, but you're still watching what's going on at all times. All right, so I've now got the fish and I'm coming into my controller and I'm moving as fast as I can because I'm wasting time. I'm going to keep the fish in the water because I don't want it to anything to happen to it, and Casey's done a great job of being at the bottom of my beat marker. Now, I've got to stop here and hand it over to Casey. So once she touches it, then my responsibilities are done. So I'm not allowed to touch the fish. Another very important rule in relation to the water and the beat is that nobody is allowed in the water in a competitor's beat, and that includes the controller. So when you're controlling someone, you're not allowed to get into the water. So if they hook a fish, they've got to bring it to you on the bank. So if Casey here was my controller and I hooked a fish and I was carrying it in my net to Casey, Casey can't step in the water here or meet me somewhere to help me get the fish in. I've got to come over to her out of the water and hand her the fish in the net out of the water. So at no time as a controller can you come into the water, and neither can anybody else. So what you'll find is that team captains will often come down to help a competitor out, and a team captain is the only person who's allowed to communicate with a competitor while the session is running. So for the 3 hours of the session, the team captain is the only one who can talk to the competitor. Of course you can as a controller, but you can't have any external people, teammates, friends, managers to come down and help a competitor in any way. Only the team captain, and the team captain will present his team captain badge, which should have a photograph of the team captain on it. And that means that that team captain can talk to the competitor throughout the fishing session. He's still not allowed to hand him rods, carry rods for him, or do anything physical for him, but he can provide support and talk to him. before the 3 hours starts and after the end of the session, anyone can talk to the competitor at any stage, obviously out of the water, but during that 3 hours, it's only the team captain and you as the controller who can communicate with the fishermen. Mobile phones, it's a good segue through to mobile phones. Mobile phones should not be used at any stage through those 3 hours, so the competitor cannot speak on a mobile phone to anyone. No mobile phones at all. And as a controller, you're only allowed to use your mobile phone for an emergency, so if there's a medical issue, or if you're ringing in official scores and there is a ruling that you can use your mobile phone. So you don't sit on the bank talking on the phone to someone whilst the competitor is fishing. So mobile phones are basically out unless it's official business or it's for a medical emergency. Okay, so I've now hooked a fish and I'm going to fight it, and now my controller knows I'm fighting one, so they're going to watch because this fish could be foul hooked. So the controller needs to watch very carefully and watch how the fish is behaving. When they're foul hooked, they fight far harder than they should fight. Generally, competitor has trouble getting them in, and you'll see them sort of rolling and rolling in the water. Now, sometimes the hook is in the mouth and they're twisted in the line, but it's very important that the controller keeps an eye on it and make sure the fish is not foul hooked, because it does not count if it's hooked behind the gill plates, and we'll show you where that is in a minute. So I'm now going to land that fish. Now, if this fish was foul hooked, what sometimes happens is, again, and remembering we're just talking about some people, some of the rules are in place for those people who like to try and bend them. And if this fish is foul hooked, what they will try and do is some people will put their hand in the net like this to try and get the fly out of the fish, so that when they get to you, and then they'll plead that like they didn't know that they did anything wrong. And remember that everybody fishing in these World Championships knows the rules. So you don't have to worry about them not knowing the rules. They know the rules. Do not touch the fish. You can shout out from the other side of the river. If your hand goes anywhere near the net, touches the fish like this into the net, does not count. So remember that all the time, and that often will happen when a fish is foul hooked and a competitor is keen to have it measured. So it's very important to remember that. The other thing that they will do sometimes is when it's foul hooked, they'll bounce the fish up and down, coming in, because they want that fly to become dislodged. So when they get to you, and often the fly is dislodged, it's already fallen out of the fish and it's in the net. So you always have to assume the fish has been hooked correctly, unless you see that it's been foul hooked, and you will say so. You'll say, I reckon that fish is foul hooked, and you let them know that as they're fighting it or as they're netting it or whenever. You'll see the fish sometimes coming backwards into the net. Classic case of a fish being hooked in the tail. So it's very important that the controller keeps an eye on that all the time, all right? Because not all competitors are perhaps as honest as we would like them to be. And so it's very important that you keep an eye on that and make sure that all the fish are hooked forward to the gill plate, and anything that's not you, it is not just your right, but it's your duty to make sure that that fish is not scored and it's released unharmed. And some people are not happy with that, but that's how it is. Those are the rules. So Casey is in a perfect spot for me to come in now and get this measured. I've hooked it and landed it right here. I've got the shortest possible route to my controller, who's been back off the bank watching carefully. So if this fish has come off in the net, the fly has dislodged, and we'll come in and measure it and show you exactly where the location is where the fish does and doesn't count. There's just a few more things that I need to tell you about if you're going to be controlling at the World Championships in 2019. First of all, competitors are not allowed to swim. So you can't swim across the river to get to the other side. One of your feet has to be touching the ground at all times. Now, occasionally someone gets washed away. It's unlikely to happen in Tasmania because the rivers don't push that hard, but basically no one's allowed to deliberately swim. People try and bounce across the bottom of the riverbed, but the rules state that at least 1 foot has to be on the ground at all times. There is no swimming. So if someone tries to get across the other side like that, then you give them a warning and tell them they can't do that and bring them back to the near side before they keep fishing. Secondly, that every fish has to be presented to the controller in a net. So you have to have a net. So if someone loses their net, basically the rules say that you can't actually land a fish. You have to present the fish, I beg your pardon, to the controller in the net. So you net the fish, present it to the controller. Without a net, you can't do that, and therefore none of the fish are going to be eligible. So people will often carry a second net or try and get hold of a second net before the session time starts. So every competitor has to have a net. And thirdly, the minimum legal size for a fish to count is 20 centimetres, so 200 mils. So if a fish is smaller than 20 centimetres, it does not count and just goes back. It's not written down on the scorecard. It's as if it never ever happened, basically. So you don't write in that they call it a 19.7 centimetre fish. It does not get taken up to 20 centimetres. So a 19.1 centimetre fish does not go to 20. Now that happens beyond 20, but 20 is the cutoff. Any fish under 20 centimetres, 19.999 does not measure and therefore doesn't count, and the fish gets released back into the water. Various countries have various rules. That's one of the rules in FIPS Mouche, the world's governing body for international fly fishing, who make the rules. That's one rule that can change from country to country. And in Tasmania, the rule is 20 centimetres. If a fish does not reach 20 centimetres, it doesn't count. Simple.
Controllers will be responsible for 2 competitors in boat sessions during the championships. Controllers will be allocated a boat to control. The competitors will find out on the bus on the way to their venues which boat they'll be allocated to. The use of depth sounders and fish finders is prohibited. Competitors are only allowed to have one rod set up when they're fishing in the competition. Any other spare rods they want to carry with them must be disassembled like so and not have the reel attached. So controllers are not only in charge of driving the boat and managing the boat, but they also must ensure that they're up to date with all the rules and regulations in Tasmania on the waters. This includes making sure them and all their competitors are wearing life jackets for the duration of their time on the boat. So before each session, boats are going to be launched 10 minutes before the start of the actual session. And then we also have 15 minutes of steaming time. So if the session starts at 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock, that means the boats actually depart from the boat ramp with the controller and the 2 competitors 15 minutes before the start. So we're looking at 12:45 or 11:45 in that scenario.
Each competitor will be in command of the boat for half of the session. The odd-numbered angler in the draw will control the boat first, and the even-numbered will control the boat second.
So we're just moving spots in the lake now, and if we're in the competition, we need to remember that we must give 50 metres to all the other boats and competitors. So if I'm the controller driving here, and the competitor asks me to slot into that bank over there, and there's another competitor drifting along there, you actually have the right to say, no, we can't actually go within 50 metres of that boat. So there are going to be heaps of different types of boats and motors used in the competition. So to keep things fair, there are going to be speed limits set on each of the lakes. Little Pine and Penstock are going to have a 5-knot speed limit, and then on Woods Lake, there'll be 10 knots. So on our Tasmanian lakes, we have quite a few buoys. On Little Pine and Penstock in particular, you will see some. This particular one here is a no boating buoy because of the dam wall there. So on Penstock, it's important to note that there are boating corridor buoys. So when you're moving along, when you're driving up and down the lake, you want to stick to the boating corridor and then head east or west to set your drifts. On Little Pine Lagoon, there are buoys that run along the edge of the island up towards the top end there. It's very important to make sure when you do go past those buoys, you have the motor trimmed up. The water's quite shallow, and that way you're not going to stir up the bottom, displace the sediment, chew up the weed beds. Now, when you are controlling the boat for competitors, it's important when you pull up to set your drift that you need to make sure the competitors don't cast while the boat's under power or moving because of the motor. So when we're setting our drift, you want to bring the boat around, set it up so that your boat's stationary, and then you can actually cut your motor and make sure the boat's drifting freely, because you're not allowed to be drifting under power, or if you're hooked up on the bank or your drogue's wrapped around a rock or a log, it's not allowed. So you have to be drifting freely with the wind. So the wind's just picked up a little bit, so we've decided to put the drogue in over the back. Whoever's controlling the boat for that 2 hours has the right to make the decision whether they put the drogue in or out. So the controller's in charge of holding the drogue making sure they set it out the back of the boat. And once the drogue at the start of the session has been put on one side of the boat, it has to stay there for the whole session. So you can't swap sides. We can't go, you know what, we want to fish out this side of the boat, we're going to put it out that side. It has to stay over there. So as a competitor, I'm allowed to fish my quarter of the boat, so my 90 degrees. I just made a cast then, I'll make it again. That cast is straight down the middle of my sector. So I'm allowed to fish anywhere from here, all the way across to my left, out towards the back of the motor. So the furthest across I can make a cast and fish is straight back off the motor like that. So my competitor, my opposition who's going to be at the front, he's allowed to fish in his front quarter over there. So as a controller, you've got to be switched on. If a competitor makes a cast across the boat like that from my position, you have to give them a warning and say, look, that fly's not landed in your water. You're not allowed to fish there. Make your cast again. Now, as a competitor, I have to remain seated while I'm fishing. So I'm at the back of the boat here. When I make a cast, when I change flies, I have to remain in this seat. The only time I can actually stand up is if I need to net a fish. So fingers crossed we find one. So we finally found a fish and I'm allowed to stand up to net him as he dips away from me. And he's not a big fish, but the good thing is he's 20 centimeters because in the competition on all the lake venues, 20 centimeters is the legal size for the fish. And there he is, nose on the end. Whoop. We're looking at 24 and a bit centimeters there. So the controller's in charge of actually releasing the fish, but if in the occasion of multiple fish being caught at the same time, the controller's allowed to ask the competitor to revive the fish and release it. So this fish was a little bit groggy, so as a controller you're allowed to get the competitor to help revive the fish while you're scoring, and away he goes.
Right, the final thing to be aware of when you're controlling is obviously look out for unethical or rude behaviour. So there are actually rules within the FIPS Mouche rule book to say that anglers need to behave properly and behave well, and there's no reason for them to be unethical in any way towards you as a controller or a fellow competitor or anyone like that. So if someone's behaving in that way, yeah, sure, people get angry with themselves and might say a few expletives, but if someone's actually being rude and behaving poorly, give them a warning. If it goes any further than that, record it on the sheet, just as any serious violation of any of the codes should be recorded on the score sheet, and take it to the sector judge. So every single sector, the 5 sectors of the World Championships, will have a sector judge, the chief person who oversees and overlooks everybody else, and you take that to them, explain to them what happened, and if any further action needs to take place, then they'll take it up. But very important to remember that the competitors are very grateful that you're out there, you're helping them. These competitions cannot happen without controllers. It's absolutely wonderful to have you spend your time out on the river with all of us competitors, and we are truly grateful for it. And we thank you very much, and I hope you make plenty of good friends and learn a lot about fishing and how people from around the world fish and how they go about catching the fish from the water. And no doubt at the presentation at the end, I'm sure that a few flies and good stories will be coming your way and you'll have friends forever. So thank you very much.